Officer Wade Prentice had worked the same stretch of county road for 9 years, and in that time he'd developed a private theory about the cars that passed through it. A theory he'd never once had reason to test against anything but his own certainty, because nobody out here ever pushed back hard enough to matter. The car that caught his eye that Sunday afternoon was a 15-year-old Buick sedan, the paint faded to a chalky silver, moving at a careful, deliberate pace, well under the speed limit, down a road that ran past a scattering of modest farmhouses toward the county's one remaining grocery store. Behind the wheel sat Odessa Marsh, 78 years old, a woman who had lived on this road for 4 decades, driven this exact route to church and back nearly every Sunday of her adult life, and had never once, in all that time, been pulled over for anything. Prentice pulled out behind her anyway, following for the better part of a mile before he found what he decided was sufficient justification. A brake light that flickered, just once, as she slowed for a stop sign. A flicker that most officers would have let pass without a second thought, and that Prentice chose instead to treat as the opening he'd apparently been waiting for. Dispatch, Unit 6, I've got a vehicle with a possible equipment violation, requesting a stop on County Road 9. Odessa saw the lights in her mirror and pulled onto the gravel shoulder without hesitation, her hands settling onto the wheel at 10 and 2, the careful, deliberate posture of a woman who had been taught, decades earlier, exactly how to conduct herself in this precise situation, and had never once forgotten the lesson, even though she'd never before had reason to use it. "Afternoon, ma'am." Prentice leaned down to her window, his tone carrying the particular, performative politeness of a man who considered courtesy a formality rather than a genuine disposition. "Your brake light's flickering. License and registration." "Of course, officer." She retrieved both from the glove box with unhurried, steady hands, her voice carrying the soft, patient cadence of a woman who had spent 78 years navigating exactly this kind of encounter and had long ago decided that calm compliance, however unjust the circumstances, was the surest way to end it quickly. He studied her license for far longer than its contents required. "This address current?" "It is. I've lived at that address since 1987. "Where are you headed today?" "The grocery store. My granddaughter's coming for supper tonight, and I'm short on a few things." "You got someone who can vouch for that? Or is that just what you're telling me?" The question landed with a particular, deliberate ugliness, not because it was aggressive in tone, but because of the flat, unnecessary suspicion embedded in it, applied to an elderly woman on a Sunday drive to buy groceries for her family. A question Prentice would never have thought to ask most of the other drivers who traveled this exact road every week. "I don't believe I need anyone to vouch for a trip to the grocery store, officer." "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why? You mentioned a brake light. I'm happy to have that looked at, but I don't understand why I'd need to step out for that." "Ma'am, I don't need to explain my reasons to you. Step out of the vehicle." She stepped out, her joints protesting the motion in a way that made the process slower than Prentice's impatient posture seemed to expect. One hand braced against the doorframe, the other steadying herself against the car's faded silver hood. "I'm going to search your vehicle." "On what grounds, may I ask?" "On the grounds that I said so. You want to keep asking me questions, or you want to cooperate?" She said nothing further, standing on the gravel shoulder in a modest floral dress and cardigan, her purse held against her chest, watching with the same patient, unhurried composure she'd carried since the moment the lights first appeared in her mirror. A composure that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the particular, weathered dignity of a woman who understood, better than the officer standing in front of her, exactly how this kind of encounter tended to end for people like her, and had decided, a long time ago, that surviving it intact mattered more than winning an argument about its fairness. Prentice searched the Buick with a thoroughness bordering on theatrical, emptying her grocery list from the passenger seat onto the gravel, rifling through a worn Bible in the glove compartment, running his hand beneath both seats with the exaggerated care of a man expecting to find something significant. He found nothing, because there was nothing to find. You want to tell me why an elderly woman's got a car registered under a Marsh, but insurance paperwork under a different name in this glove box? That would be my late husband's name, officer. He passed 11 years ago. I never got around to updating the paperwork, since the car's been mine outright the whole time, and I've never had cause to think it mattered. It was, in fact, a perfectly ordinary explanation, the kind that would have satisfied any reasonable officer within seconds. Prentice received it instead, with a slow, deliberate skepticism that had far less to do with the actual paperwork and far more to do with a private conviction he'd carried into the stop before he'd asked a single question. The same conviction, unexamined and unchallenged for 9 years, that had led him to pull her over in the first place. I'm going to need you to come with me to the station while we sort out some inconsistencies here. Officer, I don't understand what inconsistency there could possibly be. My license is current, my registration matches the vehicle, and I've told you plainly why the insurance paperwork carries my late husband's name. You can explain all that at the station. Part 2. The phone call that changed everything. They processed her at the small county station with a set of forms Prentice filled out with the same unhurried, self-assured confidence he'd carried through the entire stop. A citation for the flickering brake light, and a notation in his own report describing her as evasive regarding vehicle ownership documentation. A characterization that bore no resemblance to the calm, complete answers she had actually given him on the roadside. Odessa sat in the station's small waiting area, her purse in her lap, her hands folded, and asked, quietly, for a phone call. For what? My grandson. He'll want to know where I am, since I was due at his house for supper, and I imagine he's starting to worry. Prentice allowed it, with the particular, grudging condescension of a man who considered the request an inconvenience rather than a right. And Odessa dialed the number she knew by heart, her voice steady and unhurried, despite the 2 hours she'd now spent sitting in an unfamiliar station over a flickering brake light and a search that had turned up nothing. Marcus, it's Grandma. I'm at the county sheriff's station. No, I'm fine, don't worry yourself. An officer pulled me over on the way to the store, said something about my brake light, and now I'm being asked all manner of questions about paperwork that's perfectly in order. A pause. No, don't come rushing over. I'm not hurt. I just wanted you to know where I was in case supper runs late. She hung up, and the desk sergeant nearby, who'd been half listening to the call without particular interest, went very still the moment the name attached to that gentle, unhurried conversation clicked into place in his memory. A name he'd heard, with some regularity, attached to a federal courtroom 2 counties over. Ma'am. He approached her chair with a caution that hadn't been present in his posture a moment earlier. Did you say your grandson's name is Marcus? That's right. Marcus Reeves. He's a good boy, always has been, even if he does worry more than he needs to. Judge Marcus Reeves? Federal District Court? Odessa looked up, mild surprise crossing her face at the specificity of the question. Yes, that's him. Do you know him? The desk sergeant did not answer immediately, because he was already reaching for his radio, and because the particular sinking realization settling over him that the county's federal district judge had a grandmother currently sitting in this exact waiting room over a flickering brake light and a fabricated inconsistency in a 9-year-old insurance paper had rendered him temporarily incapable of forming a more measured response. Judge Marcus Reeves arrived at the station 22 minutes later, not in his robes, but in the casual weekend clothes of a man who had been in the middle of preparing Sunday supper for his grandmother when her call came through, his expression carrying none of the practiced, unreadable neutrality he wore on the bench, only a controlled, focused urgency that made every officer in the building straighten as he walked through the door. Where is she? The desk sergeant pointed, wordlessly, and Marcus crossed the room in a few long strides, crouching beside his grandmother's chair, his hand covering hers. Grandma, are you all right? I'm fine, Marcus, truly. A little tired of sitting in this chair, but fine." He straightened, and when he turned to face the room, his voice carried the particular, measured authority of a man who had spent 2 decades in courtrooms and understood, better than almost anyone in the building, exactly how carefully the next several minutes needed to be handled. Not out of personal restraint alone, but because he understood, with total clarity, that mishandling this moment himself would undermine the very credibility he needed to bring to what came next. "I'd like to see the incident report from this stop," he said, to the room in general. "And I'd like to speak with the arresting officer directly." Wade Prentice, who had been watching the last several minutes unfold with a slowly dawning, unwelcome comprehension of exactly whose grandmother he'd spent the last 2 hours treating with casual, unexamined suspicion, stepped forward, with considerably less swagger than he'd carried onto County Road 9 that afternoon. "Your Honor, I want to explain the circumstances of the stop." "You'll have every opportunity to explain the circumstances," Marcus said, his tone even, controlled, giving nothing away. "But I want to be direct with you about something first. My grandmother has driven that exact stretch of road every Sunday for 40 years. She raised 4 children and buried a husband on a farm 2 miles from where you pulled her over today. She has never, in 78 years, been arrested, cited, or detained for anything beyond a parking violation in 1994 that she still brings up at family dinners because she considers it a personal embarrassment. I would like you to explain to me, specifically, what about a flickering brake light required a full vehicle search, a 2-hour detention, and a report characterizing her as evasive, when every single answer she gave you, according to her own account, was complete, calm, and true?" Prentice had no answer that survived the specificity of the question, because there wasn't one. Only the same private, unexamined instinct that had pulled him behind her car in the first place. An instinct that had never once, in 9 years, been forced to justify itself to anyone with the standing to actually demand an answer. Part 3. What 40 years bought her. Judge Reeves did not use his position to have the citation quietly dismissed, nor did he demand any immediate disciplinary action on the spot, a restraint that surprised several officers watching the encounter unfold, and that Marcus later explained, in the formal complaint he filed the following week, as a deliberate choice. "I did not want this handled as a favor to a judge's family member," he wrote in the complaint's opening paragraph. "I wanted it handled as what it actually was, a citizen's complaint regarding an unlawful search and a fabricated characterization in an official police report, to be reviewed with exactly the same scrutiny it would receive if my grandmother were any other 78-year-old woman in this county without a grandson wearing a robe." The county sheriff's internal review, conducted under the unusual pressure of a sitting federal judge's formal written complaint, moved with a thoroughness that Odessa's initial 2-hour detention had conspicuously lacked. Investigators pulled Prentice's dashcam footage, which corroborated in full Odessa's account of the stop. Her calm, complete answers to every question, her patient compliance with an unlawful search, and Prentice's own recorded voice asking whether she had someone to vouch for a trip to the grocery store. A question that, played back in the sterile context of a formal review, carried an ugliness that had been easier to overlook in the moment than it was on tape. The review also surfaced something Prentice had not anticipated. 3 prior citizen complaints, filed over his 9 years on the force, alleging strikingly similar conduct. Elderly black residents of the county, stopped on minor pretexts, subjected to searches that turned up nothing. Each complaint closed by the department's own review process as unsubstantiated. Each closure citing insufficient evidence in files that, investigators now discovered, had never included so much as a request for the officer's own dashcam footage. "I want to understand something," the review board's chair said during Prentice's formal hearing, sliding a folder across the table. 3 prior complaints, each describing nearly the exact pattern documented today. A stop on a minor pretext, an unjustified search, no violation found, and a report characterizing the driver as uncooperative or evasive, despite their own calm, complete answers. All three closed without your dashcam footage ever being reviewed. Can you explain how that happens 3 times? Prentice did not have an explanation that survived contact with the question, because the honest answer, that his private theory about which drivers merited suspicion had simply never been tested against an institution with any real appetite for testing it, was not one he was prepared, or perhaps even able, to say out loud. He was terminated within the month, the board's written findings citing not only the incident involving Odessa Marsh, but the department's own prior failure to meaningfully investigate the 3 complaints that preceded it. An explicit, uncomfortable acknowledgement that the review process itself, not merely one officer's judgment, had failed for years before a judge's grandmother happened to be the one sitting in the passenger seat of the wrong outcome. Odessa Marsh did not attend Prentice's termination hearing, nor did she give any public statement in the weeks that followed, preferring instead the quiet, unhurried rhythm of the life she'd led for 4 decades on County Road 9. Sunday drives to the grocery store, supper with her grandson on the evenings he could get away from Chambers. The particular, hard-won piece of a woman who had survived a great deal in 78 years, and had never once expected any of it to end with the sheriff's department reforming its complaint review process in her name. She did, however, agree to a single conversation with a local reporter covering the story, conducted at her kitchen table of a coffee she insisted on making herself, despite her grandson's gentle protests. "People keep asking if I feel vindicated," she said, turning her cup slowly in her hands. "I don't know that vindicated is quite the word. I think about those 3 other complaints, the ones nobody looked at properly before mine. 3 other families in this county who went through something like what happened to me and were told there wasn't enough to investigate. There was enough. There was dashcam footage sitting in a file the whole time that nobody thought to pull, until my grandson happened to be the one making the request. I don't think that's justice, exactly. I think that's just what happens when the right person finally asks the right question. I'd like it to stop depending on who's asking." She sipped her coffee, and when the reporter asked whether she planned to drive that same stretch of road again, Odessa looked mildly puzzled by the question, as though it hadn't occurred to her that she might do otherwise. "Of course I will. It's the way to the grocery store. I'm not going to let one afternoon change 40 years of Sunday drives." A small, private smile crossed her face. "Though I'll admit, I do check that brake light a good deal more carefully these days than I used to." The county sheriff's department, under continued pressure from the judge's formal complaint and the resulting public attention, implemented a new policy within 3 months, requiring dashcam footage review for any citizen complaint alleging an unjustified search. A small, mechanical fix, Judge Reeves noted in a brief statement following its adoption, for a failure that had taken his own grandmother's flickering brake light and his own standing to demand accountability to finally force into place. "I would like it understood," he said, "that my grandmother should never have needed a federal judge in the family for this to be taken seriously the first time. The families before her deserved exactly the same scrutiny her case received, and they didn't get it, because nobody with sufficient standing happened to be asking on their behalf. That is the actual failure this case reveals, and it is the one I intend to keep working on, long after this particular officer's name has been forgotten." The end.